Welcome to the Clandestine Radio Podcast, Season 3.
Good evening, curious minds out there across the world, and welcome to Behind the Radio for Season 3, Episode 8, Threads of Corruption, as well as our 9/11 retrospective. I mean, come on. You had to know that I was going to put something out today. As always, I'm your host, DJ Joswa, and today is, of course, Thursday, September 11th, 2025. And tonight, we mark 24 years since the tragic events of 9/11-2001. Which was a day that changed many lives, including my own, and sent me down this path of questioning narratives and seeking the truth. It was a pivotal day for our country as well, as it was used as the catalyst to propel us into a seemingly never-ending run of regime change and forever wars all across the Middle East. Acts that were used to excuse away spending trillions of dollars, taking the rare economic surplus left behind by the Clinton administration and turning it into the massive debt that we are currently being crushed beneath. Had it not been for the endless printing and borrowing of money to fund these foreign wars, ones that, if anything, only made the region and ourselves less safe today, we wouldn't be seeing the massively out-of-control inflation crisis seen today. I've told this story on here before, but for context, I'll quickly just share with you guys a little more openly my perspective from my experience of what happened around 9/11. So roughly a month or two before 9/11, I had left the U.S. military. Shortly before that, I had received intel, thanks to, I'll just say, access afforded to me, that the U.S. was on the brink of war in the Middle East and that we would be fighting 6 wars across 5 years, those being Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, and Sudan, and ending with the ultimate goal of being Iran. This would later be seemingly confirmed in March of 2007 by retired General Wesley Clark in an interview with Amy Goodman from Democracy Now! He'd also written about this in a 2003 book called Winning Modern Wars, but this was where it really truly broke to the public. I don't think a lot of people really bought that book. It was a different time, kids. We didn't have such immediate internet access and communication, so a lot of things could fly under the radar back then. If you'll notice, nowhere on that list does it mention Afghanistan, by the way. And that's because fighting terrorism there was more about image and less about the neocon agenda behind it all, which was to overthrow unfriendly governments and install people more sympathetic to U.S. global hegemony. Just to sum that up in a little nutshell for you, I can break down how that plan played out and the telling nature between what happened and which ones stalled out and why in detail, but I'm sure that's not why you clicked on this episode. I don't really know why you did click on this episode, but I'm very grateful that you did. So I'll spare you that rabbit hole for tonight. But we will get into some things about 9/11 in the second half of the show. However, because even aside from what I've just told you, the years spent researching it in the wake of that day, digging for the truth, played a major role in shaping the investigative lens through which I view the cases and stories I bring to you guys even now. That same drive fueled my series on Franklin, and in this BTR, we're going behind part 3 of that series with some added details and also revisiting and remembering 9/11 at the end of it. And I've got a couple of angles about 9/11 that I've been thinking about since that Season 1 series, which was our first multi-part deep dive that we did here on this channel. The plan is to recap the heart of part 3 of the Franklin series with a little bit of added context, and then take a look back, so maybe with some fresh eyes and a little bit of new information. This is likely to be on the longer side of BTR than a lot of these, so go ahead and grab a coffee, or maybe a stiff drink, and let's unpack these stories together, shall we? And welcome back to part 3, BTR episode on the Threads of Corruption episode from the Franklin series. And for anyone who hasn't heard episode 8, you may want to skip the first half of tonight's show until you have. I don't know why you're here if you haven't. Go listen to it. I'm going to keep the focus on some of the newer information as much as possible, but we will probably be referencing back to and at least expanding on some of those key segments from it, so just a heads up. While parts 1 and 2 centered around the events of the Franklin scandal itself and its subsequent cover-up, part 3 kind of deviated from that case entirely, and we traced the connective threads that made up that shadowy web that spans the world, as well as how and why it keeps appearing. Through the documents, we were able to extract some pretty alarming similarities that seem to repeat time and time again. Stepping back from the Franklin case, but keeping the main points in mind, being institutional complicity and betrayal, suppression and obstruction of evidence and investigations, police looking the other way or even being actively involved, intelligence fingerprints all over the case, involvement of elites or politicians, usually both, vulnerable youth caught up in trafficking rings with the powerful, and by the end, it became more and more clear that Franklin wasn't an anomaly, or just the perversions of a single man, but a blueprint that didn't begin and certainly didn't end with that one case. Virtually every case had a fall guy, usually the person who acted as the procurer for the others, while the big names either remained hidden behind the cloud of media control, or, despite being directly accused, were either considered too important to have been involved, or at least too important and too powerful to actually go after. Regardless of the reasoning, in nearly every case, they managed to walk away untouched, at worst, or got a little slap on the wrist for a minor offense at the best. Just a little behind-the-scenes peek into what actually went into bringing you all that series. The research portion of this series took months, and it involved thousands of documents. That is no exaggeration. So many, in fact, that I had to build and train an AI research assistant just to be able to get through them all and attempt to extract the information from them. I mean, it wasn't as simple as just searching them for keywords or anything like that, because it's not like I decide a story and then go look for the evidence to support it. I really go through everything available and try to pull together the evidence from it to build the most logical narrative based on all of the available information, which was hard enough for several reasons on parts 1 and 2, but if you've heard part 3, then I'm sure you can imagine it was exponentially more difficult for that part, just because I had to do that for each and every one of those cases and then bring it all together in the end, starting with the Epstein case, which at the time of writing it, we hadn't even gotten this most recent document dump, which is a double-edged sword to be real with you. While I would have liked to have had any of the new information to be able to include it, or at least to cross-reference what I already had, I was already buried in documents up to my eyeballs at that point. Seriously, I mean, I found more information than I could have ever been able to include in a single segment, or really even a whole episode as it was. I did my best to cover just some of the highlights of his sordid story, and to at least get some of the main reasons that it was important to include him into that episode. I had to leave out about 5 times as much as I put in though, or else it would have taken up far more time in an already too lengthy episode to start with. Epstein was extremely connected though. And if you would ever be interested in us doing a full episode dedicated just to him and what the most recent document release and the email dump contained, then leave me a comment, let me know, and I'll try to get to it before the end of the season. In the end, his story was about many of the same components that we saw with Franklin. A network that wasn't just about abuse, but about control, leverage, and blackmail, all involving wealthy and influential figures, including powerful politicians. It was a reflection of Franklin's elite protection racket, just on a much, much larger stage. Next, we dug back into the Marc Dutroux case in Belgium, which is a story that we had already covered much more extensively in last season's Real Illuminati series. While Dutroux himself was definitely a monster, without a doubt, he certainly didn't act alone, and even more vile monsters hid behind him in the shadows. His case would expose an entire network tied to high society and powerful politicians within the EU, and the police drug their feet while kids disappeared at an alarming rate and number. Again, Franklin's shadow victims ignored, investigations stalled, police complicity, involvement, elite connections, the patterns just repeat once again. There's the Finders case, And that's a weird one, right? A cult group in the 80s linked to strange satanic rituals with kids in very unusual circumstances. Declassified FBI files hint at CIA ties. Then, after Customs and the FBI find a lot of strange and very dark things in a DC warehouse, like photos of children with apparently sacrificed goats, there was also jars of urine and feces and all manner of unusual things. The CIA just swoops in telling everyone involved to back off of it and that it's an internal matter. If you ask me, this had MKUltra Project written all over it. In the end, the case just fizzles out and disappears. Then we went to Casa Pia in Portugal, where we found hundreds of children being sexually abused at a state-run orphanage, with the involvement of politicians and media figures. Are you starting to pick up on a little bit of a pattern here? Kincora in Ireland, a boys' home where abuse was covered up with the assistance and involvement of British intelligence to protect their own and to gain leverage over groups throughout the Troubles period. And finally, there was McMartin Preschool, another case of satanic panic used to dismiss real allegations. Well, potentially anyways. In my opinion, allegations made by young children of things that were far too dark to have come from their imaginations. Cases were brought 7 years and $15 million later, and no charges stuck. 0 convictions. I really didn't have the time that would have been required to have laid out in full all of the accusations or even the archaeology in full, but I tried to at least give you an idea about the case and how the same elements were once again appearing. Like all of these cases, there's a lot more to the McMartin story than what the media would have you believe. While the majority of the children's stories are kind of difficult to substantiate, and some of them were definitely too outlandish to really be believed, maybe that was the point. Young minds are very impressionable and can be fairly easily deceived by adults in ways that would cause them to be unbelievable if they tried to tell anyone. Not saying that it's any way related, but that was a component of MKUltra as well, creating illusions and false constructs in someone's mind in order to discredit any real accusations made by them. And by tying it to elements that would seem completely absurd and impossible if the target decided to ever talk about it. While I have no firm evidence to say with any degree of conviction that is what we are seeing in this case, the destruction of 90% or better of that program's records has made the case in nearly all situations, including those that independent investigations have directly tied to the program, very difficult to substantiate, ensuring that the number one tool of spycraft, plausible deniability, remains in place. In part 3 of the series, I didn't just bring you these cases. We asked some important questions that connected them together. Why does this keep happening? What's the end game? Is it power, money, or control? Or something even darker? I'll be honest, this episode hit me hard, and further damaged what remaining shreds of faith I had in all systems. When you see these threads, Franklin to Epstein to Dutroux and so on, it's not random like they would have you believe. It's a system. And pulling it all together, finding those connections, is what made part 3 one of the most intense episodes for me yet. I want to know what you think, though. If you heard the last episode, what stood out to you the most? Leave me a comment, shoot me an email, hit me on the socials, whatever you want to do out there, and let me know because I'd love to hear your thoughts on it for real. Before we move on and get into the 9/11 stuff a little more, I just want to do what this BTR series was originally intended to do, which is for me to just kind of speak candidly with you guys for a second, if that's okay. Making this series was rough, and it was emotional for me, and making part 3 was all of that, plus it felt like assembling a puzzle, but half the pieces were missing and the other half were on fire. Seriously though, connecting these cases, it wasn't easy. Each one is a whole ass rabbit hole unto itself. Court docs, declassified files, survivor testimonies, old newspaper clippings, some of which are barely online, and the ones that are almost impossible to read. I spent weeks cross-referencing this stuff, trying to separate the facts from the noise. Like with the finders, for example, those declassified FBI files. They exist, and they're in the research folder for you if you're curious, but they're intentionally vague, and you have to work through all of it, the redactions that are all through the whole thing, to even try to start piecing it together. I'm currently working on another AI that I've been feeding thousands of files to try to teach it to make at least educated guesses about what lies behind those blocks of redacted text. I'll keep you guys posted. Hopefully that's going to work out and make things a little easier in the future, at least give us a better rough guess. But that's another reason that it took so long to get that episode out to you. Another moment in all of this that stuck out to me was during the Casapia investigation. And I didn't get to any of this in like real detail during the episode, but the scale of it. It was hundreds of kids over decades, and Portugal's elite were just circling the edges of the entire case. I mean, it's staggering. I found a 2004 report from a Portuguese outlet, and it was detailing how key figures were named, but they escaped justice that the others received due to their connections to Socialist Party leader at the time, Eduardo Ferro Rodrigues. Later, the weekly paper Espresso would publish a report on May 25th of 2003 of accounts from 4 of the children claiming that they saw Rodrigues at locations that they were taken to and sexually abused at. There's just layers and layers to all of these cases is what I'm saying. It's Franklin all over again. Victims come forward and risk everything to speak out, and then they get smeared or ignored or just completely discredited in front of everyone else. And reading those kids' stories, knowing the vast majority are still out there waiting for justice that's not coming, it's kind of heavy. And it reminds me why I guess I keep pushing things like this through, though, and why these stories are so important. Putting this last episode together changed how I view these sorts of cases, though. It's not always about one bad guy or one corrupt department. It's about systems, government, media, intelligence agencies that all let this happen at best, or facilitated and covered it up at the worst. And that's why this work is so important to me. It's not just history, it's a warning. It's what happens when good men do nothing. It's what happens when we fail to hold those with power accountable. Fail in our duty as being watchers on the wall, if you will. When we allow evil, true evil, to grow and fester because we're afraid to speak up or to stand out. And these stories are the repercussions of that inaction. So they can call me what they want, conspiracy theorist. I've heard it a billion times, trust me. Call me crazy. I no longer give a shit, to be honest. Because at least I had the guts to speak out and to speak truth to power. And to try to tell these stories that the system wants so badly to remain buried. At least I know that I did my best to do my part, regardless how insignificant that might seem to most people, or might actually be in the scheme of things. And if you can't leave this earth tomorrow knowing that you tried your best to change it for the better, at least in some small way, I mean, then what are you doing? What are you here for? What are you waiting for? I can assure you, as you lay there dying at the end of your life, the opinion of people on the internet will be the last thing on your mind. But knowing that you did your best, that you tried your hardest whenever you could, I feel like that will be the true comfort. Okay, rant's over, guys. Let's revisit 9/11. And welcome back, guys. This is our 9/11 retrospective piece for tonight. I think it's kind of more than a retrospective, though. I guess it's more of a chance to discuss some of the more controversial, shall we say, elements that I left out originally, or I guess that I couldn't prove at the time, as well as a chance to kind of quickly cover some of the more recent developments that have happened in the time between our Season 1 deep dive and today's 24th anniversary. I don't want to neglect to recognize the very real human cost that was paid on that day. As a direct result of the planes and the destruction of Towers 1, 2, and 7, as well as whatever hit the Pentagon, excluding the 19 hijackers, several of whom were actually later found to be alive, but that's another story for another time. An estimated 2,977 people lost their lives on that fateful day alone. And as staggering as that figure is, that doesn't even tell the full story of the human toll. Because when you factor in the subsequent deaths of those who passed away from illnesses that were caused directly by them being part of the rescue efforts, those that were working and living around the area at that time, then the numbers become even more staggering and the reality that much more grim. The World Trade Center Health Program, which was established to provide medical monitoring and treatment for those that were exposed to all of the toxins from the attacks, namely the asbestos-filled dust and the contaminants that blanketed the surrounding area. It published its last report on the numbers that I could find on March 27th of this year, and its total for those enrollees who passed as a direct result of their exposure was an astonishing 8,215 deaths. The breakdown of that looks like 5,844 were part of the response, recovery, or the cleanup efforts. 2,371 were survivors, including residents, workers, and students. So, all totaled, just from what happened that day, not even getting into the wars that followed, was well over 10,000 lives lost as a direct result of 9/11. Fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, friends, family, all lives that had meaning. They were stolen from us far too soon. So if anyone wonders why I care so much about 9/11, why I feel that we still deserve a real investigation by independent entities, that is why. Because those people deserved better, and we all deserve to know the truth. So until that day comes, it's up to us to keep talking about it, to keep digging into it, and to keep demanding a new investigation. Ever since I released that series, I've continued to think about it. I've wondered, did I say enough? Did I dig deeply enough? And even the occasional, did I say too much? Well, there's no way for me to realistically cover everything, even in a 3-part series, and certainly not to be able to fill in all of the missing pieces in this single retrospective. I at least want to bring you some of the details that I left out, maybe a brief discussion on why I did that, and give a little bit of information that I've come across or has been released since then. Starting with part 1, warnings. And just so you know, some of this tonight is completely off the cuff. Some of this is from an outline that I made, and a few parts of it are from actual written out scripting, so I'll let you just be the judge. You decide what you think each one of these are. I figure you'll probably be able to tell. So, following the end of the Second World War, as world affairs became a bigger concern domestically than they ever were before, and crises around the world were developing more rapidly than they ever had before, a need arose for the sitting president to be filled in by intelligence agencies on like a daily basis. And they went through a bunch of different styles of briefings to try and meet that demand. The first version of a fully typed out daily brief, though, would be developed by the CIA and produced by CIA officer Richard Lehman on June 17, 1961 for President Kennedy. At that time, it was called the President's Intelligence Checklist, but would later come to be known as the President's Daily Brief, or the PDB for short. You're probably wondering what that bit of useless trivia has to do with 9/11, understandably. But by now you guys should know that I have a compulsion to have to know and to subsequently have to include and tell you guys as many details as possible about things sometimes. Which makes me, a hell of a Trivial Pursuit player, but it can occasionally get in the way of storytelling, and I promise there's a point to this, and I appreciate you for sticking with me. Okay, so on August 6th of 2001, the President's Daily Brief report would land on President Bush's desk. He was actually in Texas at the time of the ranch. In this report, which was titled Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S., it would break down in no uncertain terms that due to a long list of U.S. operations against bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, reports indicated that since at least 97, bin Laden had been determined to conduct terrorist attacks on U.S. soil. How he had implied in interviews between 97 and 98 that his followers would follow the example of World Trade Center bomber Ramzi Youssef and, quote, bring the fighting to America. It laid out how Al-Qaeda members, including some who are U.S. citizens, have resided in or traveled to the U.S. for years, and that suspicious patterns of activity had been detected consistent with preparations for hijackings or other attacks, such as reports of Al-Qaeda members surveilling federal buildings in New York. It spoke of an FBI report of approximately 70 ongoing full-field investigations related to bin Laden. Bush's immediate response was reportedly dismissive, along the lines of, all right, you've covered your ass now, and no significant new measures such as heightened domestic alerts, interagency task forces, or targeted investigations were implemented as a result of it. CIA analysts who helped prepare the report considered the threats as being current and serious, but the administration made no effort to act on it. There was also the fairly well-known now Phoenix memo from July of 2001, where the FBI directly identified and warned about al-Qaeda-linked flight school students and the arrest of Zacarias Moussaoui that August, where the FBI requested a further investigation, but it was denied. In fact, countless reports throughout the spring and summer of 2001 were repeatedly ignored or downplayed as non-specific or potentially deceptive. Aside from everything that I covered in part 1 of that series, here are several that I left out for pacing or lack of time. Starting with the April 2001 warning from Afghan leader Ahmed Shah Mossad. In a speech to the European Parliament in Brussels, Mossad, head of the anti-Taliban Northern Alliance, shared intelligence from his agents indicating an imminent large-scale al-Qaeda terrorist attack inside the U.S. He urged humanitarian aid for Afghanistan while highlighting the very real threat, but U.S. officials did not pursue follow-up, engagement, or elevate domestic preparations in response to it. Interestingly enough, Mossad would be assassinated supposedly by al-Qaeda operatives disguised as journalists, which isn't typically the style of al-Qaeda, for the record, especially in a region where they had such power and access already, on September 9th, just 2 days before the attacks. Then there's the unusual case of the Odigo messages. Odigo was an Israeli-owned Mossad-controlled messaging app, and it ran from '99 until it was shut down in 2004. And it would let users filter out groups to send messages to based on like nearby people, or you could like search by, aside from location, nationality, common interest, things like that, and then send group messages to those users that you had located. Odigo's New York offices, interestingly enough, were situated less than a mile away from the World Trade Center. 2 hours before the first plane hit the towers, Odigo employees received a group message, reportedly in English, though I've seen several outlets report that it was in Hebrew. I don't know, there's a lot of confusion around this one. The message warned that a major terrorist attack was about to happen. Given the nature of the group's message, it is likely that other users also received this message. The 2 employees didn't alert management about the message, though, until after seeing the news of the attack, at which point Odigo Vice President Alex Diamandis would be alerted and would then track down the IP address that the message had originated from, and they would turn that info over to the FBI. 2 weeks after 9/11, Diamandis would state in an interview, quote, "The messages said something big was going to happen in a certain amount of time, and it did, almost to the minute." Diamandis would also quote, as reported by the Jerusalem Post, Israeli government figures that approximately 4,000 Israelis were supposed to have been working at the towers on 9/11. Interestingly enough, only 4 of them died that day. 3 at the towers themselves, and 1 was on one of the flights. A fact that, when taken along with the reported message, would seem to indicate not only prior knowledge, but at least some of them also received this warning. Despite being reported in the Israeli press and picked up by Brian McWilliams of Newsbites, who reported on it on September 27, 2001, this story was never followed up on. After Odigo allegedly tracked the IP that the message originated from, they would first contact Israeli security services, who would in turn be the ones who actually passed that info on to the FBI. Despite admitting that they were looking into it 2 months after 9/11 as part of their broader investigation, no leads, no suspect names, or any further information would ever be released by the FBI regarding it, and they have reportedly denied FOIA requests asking for any related information over and over. It wasn't just the tower workers who missed work that morning, though. So did your friend and mine, old Lucky Larry Silverstein, who had a long-standing habit of coming in early to the office in the North Tower. Silverstein, who I went into more in depth in the 9/11 series, was the leaseholder of the World Trade Center complex, having finalized a lease just 6 months before the attacks. Since its opening in '72, the Towers complex had been state-owned by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. But by 2000, city officials were looking to offload the asbestos-riddled properties rather than to sink the billions that would have been required to actually restore them into it. Heads up, we're about to get into a complex web of Zionist interests, but this is where following the money will lead you, and all of this is fact, not opinions. Ronald Lauder is the man who headed Governor Pataki's New York State Commission of Privatization and the New York State Research Council on Privatization, and would ultimately be the person who made the call that Towers 1 and 2 should be turned over to private ownership. Totally unrelated, but Lauder was also the longtime head of the World Jewish Congress and had been oftentimes described as the man most responsible for Benjamin Netanyahu's ascent to political power. Thanks, guy. He also has connections to Israeli intelligence through funding the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya, where he established the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy, and Strategy. He is also close friends with Ehud Barak, both of whom were members of Wexner's megagroup. Need I say more? This privatization allowed for ultra-Zionists Larry Silverstein and Frank Lowy to purchase the 99-year lease in July of 2001. Silverstein and his team of lawyers would immediately go to work reworking the insurance policy on the complex and doubling their payout in the event of a terrorist attack. The buildings were insured by ACE Limited through AIG, as well as Marsh McLennan, both owned by Jules Kroll and Maurice Greenberg. And if you're playing along at home, take another shot, because yes, both are Jewish Zionists. Actually, don't do that. Seriously, you'll be dead by the end of this episode. But they would sell off the liability to various other companies shortly before 9/11, who would actually be the ones to take the massive insurance hit. Back to the morning of 9/11, Silverstein would luckily deviate from his morning tradition that morning and skipped his usual breakfast at the Windows on the World restaurant in the North Tower and canceled at least one scheduled meeting that we know of that was with the Port Authority and was set to take place on the 88th floor of Tower 1. He would instead decide at the last minute to not cancel a dermatologist appointment, as he had planned to do, because his wife supposedly laid down the law and insisted that he canceled his meeting instead, and he kept his appointment. Silverstein's two children, Roger and Lisa, also worked for his company and were also scheduled to be in meetings that morning at the towers. Despite being known as very punctual people, like their father, this morning they were supposedly running late, very late in fact, and rather than attending their 8 a.m. meeting, were still not there when Flight 11 would impact the North Tower at 8:46 a.m., sparing their lives as well. It probably bears mentioning, though totally unrelated, I'm sure, that Silverstein was also close friends with Netanyahu, and Israeli media reported that the pair spoke on the phone every Sunday for years. There is a very long list of other Zionist connections that runs all throughout the purchasing and insuring of the towers and the politics that went on behind the scenes. Really far too long of a list to detail here, but it's public knowledge for anyone that's curious. I will, however, mention a few other interesting connections surrounding the events of that day and the lead up to it, starting with the fact that the quote-unquote war on terror concept has a long and storied history. Originally conceived as far back as the 1970s by Israeli military intelligence under the leadership of Menachem Begin, the self-proclaimed father of terrorism and founder of the Likud party before serving as Israeli prime minister in 1977. The War on Terror doctrine was first rolled out at a Netanyahu Institute conference in July of '79 in Jerusalem. Their goal was to get the U.S. military involved to go after their enemies, most notably at the time, Iraq and Syria, under the pretext of fighting terrorism. If you recall, it was Netanyahu who on April 2002 took a visit to D.C. and spoke in the U.S. Senate about, quote, the urgent need to topple Saddam is paramount, and how the campaign, quote, deserves the unconditional support of all sane governments. In June of 2002, former Prime Minister and head of Israeli intelligence Ehud Barak would pen an op-ed in the Washington Post pushing the Bush admin to move against Iraq despite having no evidence of any role whatsoever that they played within the attack, saying the Bush admin should, quote, first focus on Iraq and the removal of Saddam Hussein. He and Netanyahu would write additional op-eds in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal calling for military actions against Saddam, with one line out of Netanyahu's piece titled The Case for Toppling Saddam, saying, quote, nothing less than dismantling his regime will do. During this time, then Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon would address the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee in August, proclaiming that Iraq was, quote, the greatest danger facing Israel. Not long after, the chorus of Iraq possesses weapons of mass destruction would be repeated ad nauseum, starting with a lie told by Netanyahu during congressional testimony where he stated, quote, there is no question that Saddam is seeking and is working and is advancing towards the development of nuclear weapons. No question whatsoever. And there is no question that once he acquires it, history shifts immediately. He would also make the same statement countless times regarding Iran from then until his most recent incident, when interviewed on 9/11 shortly after the attacks. Netanyahu would be quoted and recorded answering the question from journalist James Bennett of what this attack meant for Israel by saying, quote, "It's very good," while smiling, before catching himself and restating, well, it's not very good, but it's going to generate immediate sympathy, meaning from the U.S. towards Israel, and followed that up with, quote, "If you ask, will the United States blame Israel? No, I think it will do the opposite. As you know, we've experienced terror over so many decades, but the United States has now experienced a massive hemorrhaging of terror. Make of that what you will, but jumping back to early foreknowledge for just a second, in '79, Jewish-American journalist Michael Evans would have a sit-down interview with the founder of Mossad, Isur Harel. In the interview, published in the Jerusalem Post, and then revisited in another piece on September 30th of 2001, Evans would ask Harel if he thought that terrorism would come to America, and if so, where and why. He would reply by saying, quote, "I fear it will come to you in America. America has the power, but not the will to fight terrorism. As to where, New York City is the symbol of freedom and capitalism. It's likely they will strike the Empire State Building, your tallest building," which he mistakenly thought that it was, "and a symbol of your power." 21 years later, after his prediction, it would come true, except with the towers, which were much taller than the Empire State Building. In '87, two of Harel's top agents, Peter Malkin and Avraham Shalom Bindo, tried to obtain the World Trade Center security contract while working for a company owned by Shaul Eisenberg, named Atwell Security of Tel Aviv. Eisenberg was an extremely connected and powerful known Mossad operative in the Far East who was instrumental in the formation of Jewish terrorist groups Irgun and Shanghai Batar, as well as a close associate of Henry Kissinger, and worked closely with him smuggling weapons to bloodthirsty communist groups like Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge in the 70s. The security contract was all but theirs until the Port Authority called off the deal when they learned that Binder had previously been convicted of murdering 2 Palestinian teenagers while serving as the head of Israel's domestic security agency, Shin Bet, in '84. He would, however, go on to work for Jules Kroll and Maurice Greenberg's Kroll Associates, who would land the contract following the '93 truck bombing. That gets into a whole other web involving Bush's brother Marvin P. Bush and Securicom, now Stratosec, which handled another major aspect of the security prior to 9/11, that being the access control, surveillance, and related infrastructure. It's a whole Byzantine labyrinth of contracts through the New York Port Authority, which is why the security issue gets so muddled when you start digging into it. Kroll Associates handled the overall revamping following the '93 bombing, and a New York-based company called Summit Security Services was who provided the on-site physical security. I do want to clarify, care has to be taken when researching all of this, because while there is quite clearly a lot of Zionist involvement in several areas of this story, there's also a ton of false information and what could be considered anti-Semitic finger-pointing out there online. Take the case of ICTS International, a security firm founded by former members of Shin Bet that handled quite a bit of international aviation security. They also owned Huntley USA at the time, a U.S. subsidiary that handled passenger and baggage screening for several airlines during this time, which was a standard practice before the TSA was created. They would just kind of outsource the security under FAA oversight. I've seen it incorrectly reported in many sources that they handled the screening for all of the 9/11 flights and facilitated the hijackers smuggling weapons onto the planes. In reality, they only handled 2 of the 4 flights. UA Flight 175 that hit the South Tower, and UA Flight 11 that hit the North Tower. So, see? Only 2 of them. Accuracy is important. Argenbright Security and its subsidiary Globe handled the Shanksville and Pentagon quote-unquote plane. Its founder, Frank Argenbright, is quite a story, but at least as far as I can tell, he doesn't have any direct links to any of the other entities that we've discussed. Also, one thing that would seem to counter claims of Mossad involvement is an August 23, 2001 report from the Mossad that a group of up to 200 terrorists linked to Osama bin Laden were present in the United States and appeared to be planning an imminent attack. This was first reported in the German newspaper Der Spiegel and echoed in the Sunday Telegraph in London. According to those accounts, the warning was specific only in naming the U.S., but fell short of naming the target method or the date. On October 21, 2001, the Washington Post would also reference Israeli warnings in the months leading up to 9/11. Now, the cynic in me, of course, thinks back to the previously discussed finger-pointing by Netanyahu and other details that could possibly, maybe, just suggest that these quote-unquote warnings were more about implanting the idea of a fall guy that he also had trouble with than a legitimate warning of any substance. Who knows though? Maybe they were just looking out for their closest ally. I'll let you decide. Now, since I've already dove headfirst in this pool of things I'm not supposed to talk about, I would be remiss not to get into the two biggest red flags of potential Israeli involvement or complicity in 9/11. While everything else I discussed is true and verifiable, it could all just be coincidence. Just falling down the rabbit hole of the most deplorable of all conspiracy tropes of the Jews did it, that has for so long besmirched the conspiracy community. These next two are definitely the most overt examples, and they're not as easily dismissed. I do want to stop before getting into these though and clarify. I have nothing but love for the Jewish people as a whole, and while I do feel that political Zionism is a bit of a pestilence on the world and has caused a great deal of unnecessary death and suffering, that has nothing to do with the Jewish people as a religion or even the citizens of Israel, many of whom want Netanyahu to step down just as bad as the rest of the world. So please don't misconstrue anything that I say as being anti-Semitic or based in any sort of negative feelings that I assure you I do not harbor towards any group of people. This is simply the evidence that I have repeatedly come across and honestly brushed aside time and time again just to not have my research in any way incorrectly lumped together with those spewing bigoted tropes online with little to no supporting evidence. I'm only saying all of this now because I genuinely feel these are elements of the 9/11 story that also deserve to be looked into and considered. I also want to clarify that unlike many others who I've seen raise these concerns, in no way do I feel that it was strictly a false flag by the Mossad alone. It was far more complex than that, but there is no way that it happened the way that we are told that it did. And there's no way that it was pulled off without the support and backing of some intelligence agency, likely more than one. Now, like I said, these next two are really wild ones. You've more than likely at least heard of these, or definitely one of them at least, but you may not have heard the full story or gotten all the details that have come out in more recent times. So I'm sure that a lot of you probably recall the stories of the supposed Israeli art students who occupied the floors just below the 9/11 impact zone in the months and the weeks leading up to 9/11. But you may not be aware of the fact that those art students, the whole art student story, runs much deeper than that. In January of 2001, the security division of the DEA started getting a high number of unusual reports, and these were coming from DEA field offices all across the country. The reports detailed young Israelis claiming to be art students and offering artwork for sale, which isn't really the strange part. The strange part is that they were doing so while attempting to gain access to DEA offices, including a few that weren't even known to the public and didn't even have addresses, like offices that weren't recorded anywhere as being a DEA office. More than that, they had also attempted to gain access to other law enforcement and DoD agencies. And perhaps strangest of all, they had even visited the homes of numerous DEA officers as well as senior federal officials. This had been ongoing for about a year at that time, and it appeared to the DEA to be a, quote, organized intelligence gathering activity. You may have noticed that I don't say end quote anymore. It's because I use a lot of quotes and it's kind of annoying, so I'm not going to do that anymore. But the reports came in from over 40 different U.S. cities, and they would continue all throughout the first 6 months of 2001. DEA, ATF, Air Force, Security Service, FBI, and even the U.S. Marshals had documented at least 130 separate incidents of this occurring. Some of them were observed diagramming the inside of federal buildings. Some had been caught with photos taken of federal agents. One that was stopped and searched possessed banking receipts for close to $180,000 in withdrawals and deposits over a 2-month period. Some of them actually lived for a time in Hollywood, Florida, a relatively small city not far from where one of the supposed masterminds of 9/11, Mohammed Atta, and 3 other terrorists lived in the months before 9/11. Then, in March of '01, the Office of National Counterintelligence Executive, or NCIX, which is part of the CIA, would issue a warning as a sort of heads up to all federal employees about, quote, suspicious visitors to federal facilities, which also noted, employees have observed both males and females attempting to bypass facility security and enter federal buildings. Going on to say that the federal agents had, quote, arrested 2 of these individuals for trespassing and discovered that the suspects possessed counterfeit work visas and green cards. Several other agencies would also raise red flags and request that INS, or Immigration and Naturalization Services, investigate it. Soon, officials began being more proactive in their approach to the supposed art students, and while the exact numbers were never publicly released, one accounting of the story states that some 140 Israeli nationals were detained or arrested from March of '01 to September 11th. Many of them were deported. Journalists from Ceylon would investigate the story and determine that none of them were even enrolled at the art school that most of them claimed to be attending. According to the AP, 60 more would be detained and deported shortly after 9/11. Much of this info comes from an internal memo from the DEA dated in June 2001 by the DEA's Office of Security Programs, but was leaked to the press as early as December of 2001. And this is definitively where shit starts getting wild, so buckle up. Reporter Carl Cameron from Fox News will begin digging into the story and his investigation that included interviewing federal agents that were involved in the story, and he would report that some of the detainees that were rounded up post 9/11 failed polygraph questions when asked about alleged surveillance activities against and in the U.S., and that some of them were on active military duty, which is mandatory for all Israelis, by the way. This story would, unsurprisingly, get buried. The Washington Post and New York Times would reach out to contacts inside Justice, FBI, and the CIA, but none would confirm the story, so they laughed it off and assumed that Fox News had just got it wrong, and nothing further would be published inside of the mainstream media. But within the DEA, however, it struck a nerve. In an internal communication from within the DEA, they would make note of Cameron's reporting and even mention Fox News by name in the memo that was dated December 18th, just 4 days after the final installment of the investigative series came out. The document would also warn of DEA security breaches in their telecommunications by unauthorized foreign nationals, and cite an Israeli-owned firm with which the DEA had contracted with for wiretap equipment, which may have accounted for how the alleged art students had access to the home addresses of multiple agents. On February 28th of the following year, the well-respected Paris-based espionage newsletter Intelligence Online would also report on the DEA memo, as would France's newspaper of record, Le Monde, and both would come to the same explosive conclusion, that being that the activity was directly the work of a proven spy ring ran by the Mossad or Israeli government, and that it was, quote, a vast Israeli spy network. The largest case since '85, when mole Jonathan Pollard was busted selling Pentagon secrets to Mossad. Reuters would run the story as well, that same day under the headline, U.S. busts big Israeli spy ring, and would source Le Monde's story. The French journals would uncover some stunning revelations. 6 of the supposed art students were carrying cell phones that were purchased by a former Israeli vice consul to the U.S. 2 of them had traveled from Hamburg to Miami to visit an FBI agent at his home. Then they boarded a flight to Chicago and visited the home of a DOJ agent. Then they hopped on a direct flight to Toronto, all on the same day. According to the Intelligence Online piece, more than 1/3 of the supposed students, which were spread out across 42 U.S. cities, lived in Florida, with the largest groups in Hollywood and Fort Lauderdale, one-time home of at least 10 of the supposed 9/11 hijackers. In at least one case, the students lived directly adjacent to homes and apartments where the hijackers resided. Many of these quote-unquote students that the DEA reported had backgrounds in Israeli military intelligence and or electronic surveillance, with one being the son of a 2-star Israeli general, and one having formerly served as a bodyguard to the head of the Israeli army. This story actually goes way deeper with many unusual incidents and reports, way more than we can possibly have time for tonight. I just figured that since it had kind of flew under my radar for years, that there was at least a chance that many of you guys might have missed it as well. But getting back to other supposed art students, in the months leading up to 9/11, a group of Israelis, not dual U.S. citizens, just Israeli citizens, somehow managed to secure temporary construction passes to work on the 91st floor of World Trade Center 1. The passes would grant them access to the entire complex, though. The reasoning was given that they were art students in a group called Gelatin, and they needed access to work on an art project called B-Thing. What was publicly known is that at one point they removed the thick and heavy windows of an office space on the 91st floor and reportedly built a prefab balcony outside of the building. Then stretched what they referred to as putty around the windows, and they filmed it by a helicopter. And the whole project is available for viewing on YouTube, for the record, if you want to look this up. The New York Times would consider it newsworthy enough to cover. Photos taken from the artist's book called B-Thing, which were also used in the Times piece from inside their private space on the 91st floor, showed boxes stacked to the ceiling in the space with BB-18 written on them. The BB-18 that this box was referring to is a fuse holder by Little Fuse Simcom, and its purpose is to save space and workload in a complex wiring system. It is said to decrease wiring terminations. Its small footprint reduces space requirements, reduces assembly time, prevents accidental finger exposure, and is a quick and safe method of changing fuse holder configurations, which allows for future expansions, improves troubleshooting, and eliminates power distribution block. Interestingly enough, in the same photos, the ceiling tiles had also been removed, exposing the steel girders underneath. The impact points of the planes, notably, were at the 93rd and 98th floors. There would also be a full power down that was said to be so that they could work on the elevators over the weekend prior to 9/11. Which brings us to the day of, when virtually all witnesses, firefighters, and first responders reported hearing a series of explosions just before and during the collapse of all three towers. And if you recall, the floors just above the 91st floor would be the first to go, as they seemed to almost dissolve into the floors beneath without any sort of resistance. If we rewind time back about an hour to 8:46 a.m., just minutes after the first plane's impact, 5 men would position themselves and their van marked Urban Moving Systems in the parking lot of the Doric Apartments complex in Union City, New Jersey. Onlookers who had gathered to get a view of the towers from just across the water would notice the men filming the attacks, high-fiving, and obviously celebrating the attack. For years, their story would be ignored by the media, and if it was brought up at all, it would just be dismissed as a distasteful rumor or anti-Semitism at best. In 2019, however, the FBI would finally declassify 144 pages of documents from their investigation of the incident. From this, we were able to confirm the men as being Israeli nationalists. At least one witness interviewed by the FBI reported first seeing the van in the parking lot around 8 a.m., or as you may have put together by now, over 40 minutes before the first plane's impact. Later that day, about 4 p.m., the van would be spotted on a service road off of Route 3, and a police officer would pull it over. Inside were the 5 men, aged 22 to 27. Police would remove them from the van at gunpoint and place them in handcuffs. The officers would say that they saw multiple things that aroused their suspicion about the men. One of them had $4,700 in cash stuffed into his sock. Another had 2 foreign passports. A box cutter was also found in the van. Innocuous on its own, I guess, but given the events of the day, they felt that it added to the suspicion. All 5 would ID themselves as being Israeli citizens. Officers would also note that the van was, quote, oddly lacking equipment that would be typically used in a moving company's daily duties. According to an FBI report, the van also contained residue of explosives. The declassified FBI report states, quote, a search of the van and individuals was conducted at the time of the vehicle's stop. The vehicle was also searched by a trained bomb-sniffing dog, which yielded a positive result for the presence of explosive traces. Swabs of the vehicle's interior were taken, and those samples were sent to the FBI laboratory for further analysis. Final results are still pending. Attorney General at the time, John Ashcroft, despite all of this, would personally sign off on the detainee's release. Ashcroft, upon entering the private sector as a lobbyist and consultant in 2005, would take on the Israeli government as one of his first clients. One of the photos that the men took, Savan Kurzberg, was of him holding a lit lighter in the foreground with the burning wreckage of the towers in the background. The FBI reports also indicate a witness who was adamantly stating that they saw Kurzberg the day before 9/11 in the same parking lot with at least one other man conversing in a, quote, foreign language. In November of 2001, 3 of the men told their story back in Israel, with one stating that they were there to, quote, document the event. At least 2 of the men arrested were determined to have direct links to Mossad after their names popped up in a CIA FBI database of foreign intelligence operatives. The FBI file on the filming at the Doric Tower states that they were filming from 8:30 a.m. to 9 a.m., which is pretty interesting considering that the first plane wouldn't even hit the tower until 8:46 a.m. Another oddity in the report shows the presence of urban moving systems and Israeli nationalists out near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, despite an interview with the company owner stating that UMS had no deliveries outside of New Jersey that day. Yet another would be spotted near Boston around the time of the 2 flights, Flight 11 and 175, departed Boston's Logan Airport. Upon his arrest, Savan Kurzberg would tell the arresting officer, quote, "We are Israeli. We are not your problem. Your problems are our problems. The Palestinians are the problem." When you step back from all of this, you're left with a burning question. Considering the wars that resulted from the attacks and how one by one the U.S. was drawn into taking out one Arab enemy of Israel after another, could it be possible that interests so aligned in such a way between the neocons, the military-industrial complex, and Israel, that with the assistance of Mossad operatives, 9/11 was, as myself and many others have suspected from the start, merely a false flag operation, like many before it, used to drum up support for foreign wars of aggression. Wars that took the economic surplus left by the Clinton admin and flushed it down the toilet along with my generation's last hopes of financial prosperity. Because it was at that point, it was those wars that drove our national debt through the roof. It was those wars that were fought with borrowed money and no plan to pay for them, that drove inflation, that led to the slow throttling death of the American middle class, that made the world less, not more safe, as Bibi tried so hard to convince us that it would over and over. I can't definitively answer that question for you, but I think it's an important question to ask nonetheless, one that we are long overdue to get an answer for. Until that day finally arrives though, all we can do is to keep asking, keep pushing for answers, keep demanding a new and wholly independent investigation of that day, and to well and truly, never forget 9/11. This episode is dedicated to the memory of all those that we lost on that fateful day. You will forever live on in our hearts, and we will not rest until we make sure that your deaths were not in vain. My heart goes out to all of the families of victims from 9/11. I hate that you have to keep going through this every single year. More stories come up and nothing ever gets done. No real investigation and no true answers are ever given to you. And it hurts my soul every time I think about it. And I hope that you know there are those of us out there that are still fighting for answers, that haven't let this go, that haven't put it in the books of history, that haven't brushed it aside. It's still very real too, just as it is for you. And we want those answers for you as much as you want them. And my prayer is that together, one day, we can continue to pressure these people until they finally give us the real damn answers on what happened that day. Because regardless where you stand on it, I think everyone with any degree, any modicum of critical thinking skills left in their brain can recognize that what we were told is not what happened. Definitely not in total. And while I realize, I just want to say this, I realize that a lot of the things that I brought up today dealt with the Israeli government and Mossad. And it isn't because I wanted to just target them in doing this episode. It's because whenever I did the 3-part series, I left all of that stuff out. But to be completely transparent and to really call for true answers, I feel like we have to get everything out into the open. And these were things that I held back, and with everything that they're already holding back, I didn't want to omit them from the record and not be something that we at least look at or consider in some kind of way. And that was the purpose of me telling these parts of the story now, and no other ulterior motive is behind it. And I really appreciate you guys tuning into this. I'm so glad that the series that we just came through is over with, if I'm being completely honest. It really did take a lot out of me. It was very hard just to process, just to deal with the stories of those kids in each and every one of those cases. It's heartbreaking. Some truly, truly sick and twisted individuals out there. And I pray that justice comes in all of those cases eventually. If not in this life, that they meet it in the next. But I do appreciate you for listening to all of them, hopefully by now. And I hope that you did enjoy it, or I guess at least got something from it, learned a little bit more. Maybe ultimately it makes you more aware of how to recognize those kind of things when they're happening, motivates you to talk to the younger, members of your family and educate them about the potential for things like this, in some tactful manner, just so that people don't continue to fall victim to these things. There's still a lot of very sick, twisted people out there in this world, and it seems like year after year there's only more of them. But it's up to us to kind of recognize that and to call it out when we see it and to speak about it and to not be silenced and to continue to fight the good fight. I mean, I think that's really all that we can do in this life. But thank you. Have a moment of silence. Say a little prayer for the families of people that, pass away on 9/11, because I hope that their memories are still being kept alive in all of your hearts. And sorry to get so heavy on you here at the end, but I love you guys. Thank you very much for tuning in. And I will talk to you all again real soon on the next Clandestine Radio.